Hello, welcome to the similarities between the queer and deaf cultures. My name is Jace, and this is for my deaf culture and community class. I believe there are incredibly noticeable similarities and differences between the queer and deaf cultures. Some of these similarities include feelings of being othered, the misconception of differences of choice, and the importance of identity. So, before we get into some of these similarities and differences, I think it's important that we talk about some of the basic definitions for both queer identity as well as deaf identity. So, for queer identity, the term queer has had several definitions throughout history. Originally, it meant things like odd, strange, unusual, things like that, and it was typically used in a rather negative, derogatory way, specifically very much against LGBTQ folks. However, following the raid in Stonewall, the LGBTQ community had reclaimed that term, and it is now used as more of an umbrella term to reference the vast spectrum of LGBTQ plus sexualities and gender identities. And then for deaf identity, to quote Cryer, there have been many different terms used to describe people with hearing loss. Lowercase deaf, D-deaf, hard of hearing, and hear impaired. There are also several different types of hearing loss. So you have profound, severe, moderate, and mild. So depending on this, it kind of depends on how badly somebody's hearing loss is. Deaf identity would also be used as an umbrella term to describe all of those that would fall under the hearing loss category. For this term also, it would also be something that you get to decide what this term means to you. For queer culture and deaf culture, some of the key differences that I noticed while reading is people often discover that they are deaf incredibly early in life. Often people discover that their children are deaf anywhere from 3 to 6 months when they are doing testing for their children. I had taken a class a couple semesters prior where we learned that there were multiple different tests that they would do for a child, and they would often learn that a child had hearing impairment anywhere from like 3 to 6 months. And from there, they would kind of learn what they needed to do in order to help that child. Whereas those in the queer community tend to find out that they are within that community several years later. Also, a lot of the stigma and misconceptions in regard to the queer community and culture is related to religious teachings. So things like learning that being queer is a sin, or learning that practicing or doing any queer activities in general is acting in the way of the devil, things like that. Whereas for the deaf culture, a lot of it is related to the incorrect ideas of intellectual decline. So we learn that previously a lot of people believed that those who had deaf children, or deaf children in particular, were believed to be intellectually dumber. It's where the very outdated phrase deaf and dumb come from. And we also know that deafness is something that is caused in the inner ear and is something that we don't know a ton more about where queer identity comes from, but that is another key difference between the two. A brief comparison that I did want to talk about, this is going to be coming from the story from Catherine Healing's reading that we did throughout this class. I read about this and thought this would be an incredibly interesting one to talk about, so I will be using a lot of paraphrasing from her stories because I found this incredibly interesting. So firstly, I want to talk about the Stonewall Inn riot on June 27th, 1969. On June 27th, 1969, Stonewall Inn had been raided by the Manhattan 6th Precinct Police Department. Previously, there had been raids within several different gay bars throughout Manhattan around once a month. But one of the things that people don't know is that those were often given warnings in advance. So there were often deals behind the scenes between mafias and the police departments so that they knew that they were coming. People were not often harmed, and it was more of a formality thing. The difference here is that the Stonewall Inn was never given a warning. So the police had shown up around 1 or 2 a.m. Nobody at the inn was given any kind of warning, and everybody there was very thrown off. It led to a ton of physical and verbal harassment between both patrons and the police department, and patrons were arrested, and while nobody knows quite what started it, it turned from being this simple police raid into this massive riot. It led to multiple of the patrons begin throwing things at the police department, things like pennies and bricks, etc. And this led to them hiding within the inn and the tactical police force being called in, with 4 officers and several others being injured. Similarly, another story that was also shared is also about the Gallaudet University protests. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the word. In August 1987, the university had announced that the then president was going to be resigning. The school had a reputation for being the heart of culture for the American deaf, according to Healy, and as a result, many people expected the president to be a deaf one. When Elizabeth Zinsser was chosen, she was the only hearing candidate of the 3 that the board had been considering. She had no ASL experience, had no deaf culture experience, and so because of this, many students and faculty members were rightfully very angry. It caused multiple different protests to happen throughout the school, including many blockades, and it caused them to have multiple day-long protests throughout the school. Following this, on March 10th, she resigned, and March 13th, the board decided to meet all of the student demands. So, why are we talking about this? These stories point out some incredibly important details that kind of pull these 2 cultures together, at least in my perspective. They both underwent incredible stereotyping and have been seen as less than for being different. They were both seen as othered, and thus people were more willing to write them off and see them as less than and willing to harp on them and bully them. These stories also tell a story of a community making themselves be seen and heard versus just being brushed aside. Finally, it also shows people unafraid to be proud and loud about their identities. One other thing I would like to talk about is the misconception of choice. Many originally believed that the idea of being queer was a mental disorder at first. It was declassified as a mental disorder in 1973, and then people then believed it was an intentional decision that people made. They originally thought it was a moral failing or a sin that people were committing, and that people willingly decided to commit these heinous sins or crimes. However, multiple research studies have shown that it is a deeply interconnected part to one's identity, and that being queer is not just a simple decision that one makes. Similarly, the idea of choice for those who are deaf is slightly different. For them, the choices given often treat them as disabled or impaired. So for them, they have the options of like hearing aid or cochlear implants. They have the options of like learning ASL or learning how to read English or be able to kind of speak English as well. Many will use these options as a reason for fitting in and feeling included with the world around them. But the reason why many of them may not use these options is because of them seeing it as a reason of fixing something that they do not see as an impairment to their world. From this, we see that there are several similarities between the queer and deaf cultures. From the ideas of being othered from those who see them as different, to having to loudly advocate for themselves to be seen, to the idea of proudly advocating for their identity. That said, there are also many differences. Between many deaf people being deaf from birth, whereas queer people often discover they are queer years after birth, to those who are deaf or hard of hearing having issues more directly connected to communication. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all coming. Here are the references. I'm going to move so you guys can see. Okay. Perfect. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.